There was a request to talk about free will. So how do we deal with free will? Do we really have a choice, or is everything kind of like predetermined and we don't really choose? Because on the one hand, the Torah tells us pretty openly in Dvarim, we've all heard this pasuk many times, God says, "Ha'idoti b'chem hayom et hashamayim ve'et haaretz," right? That God brings heaven and earth to witness that achaim ve'amavet, that life and death, natati lefanecha, that God gave before us, abracha ve'aklala, and He gave before us blessing and curse, uvacharta b'chaim, and you should choose the good path, the path of life and the path of blessing, and not the path of curses and death, and choose the right path. So, I mean, it's really Moshe obviously saying this, but quoting God in Dvarim. God tells us really clearly that He gave us free will, and you should choose life. Ubacharta b'chaim, choose the path of life. But then we also say God knows everything. And then the Talmud comes in and says something else. The Talmud comes in and says these famous words, which you've also heard before, V'amar Rabbi Chanina, hakol b'yedei shamayim, right? Hakol b'yedei shamayim, that everything's in the hands of heaven, chutz mi'irat shamayim, except the fear of heaven. Everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. It's almost like the only real choice that you have is to choose to believe or not. That's it. And how do we know? Because everything that they say has to have, everything that our sages say has to have a proof from the Torah. So what's the proof from the Torah? Rabbi Chanina brings another verse. What's the other verse? Another verse in Dvarim, which says, V'ata Israel, ma Hashem Elohecha shoel meimach. What does God ask of you? Ki'im le'ir'ah. Right? That's how the verse continues. To fear God. So Rabbi Chanina says, based on that, God is saying, what is God asking of you? Just to fear God. That means that's really the only choice you have, whether to fear God or not. That's it. Everything else is kind of predetermined, and your only choice is whether to be a believer or not a believer. That's very interesting. So it almost seems like it contradicts the other idea that you have total free will. So the first question is, do I really have free will? And how do I have free will if God knows everything anyways? All right, so Rabbi Akiva says in Pirkei Avot, Hakol tzafui ve'arashut netuna, that everything's foreseen and yet you still have free will. You're still given free choice. How is that possible? That's the first question. The second question is, okay, so like God kind of pre-programmed you. You have a unique soul, perhaps some kind of destiny. So does that mean that destiny is inescapable? That like you cannot mess with your fate? That's it? That's like all you have to, like what'll happen to you is exactly how kind of God pre-programmed your life, and that's how it's going to run. That's how it's going to roll, and there's nothing you can do about it. Right? So is everything kind of predetermined for you? And this really ties into a more scientific question of the whole famous nature versus nurture debate. Like there's the same debate takes place in science, nature versus nurture, meaning are you the way you are because of your nature, because of your genetics, or because of your nurture, because of the way you were raised and what you experienced in your early years, and those experiences shaped you, and that's who you are.
But they're mutually exclusive? Can't be both?
Yeah, it is. I mean, usually we say that it's kind of both, right? Like environment plays a role, genetics plays a role. But it's interesting, like today geneticists are finding all kinds of things. Like if you do one of these genetic tests, something like even, there's a famous one, the cilantro aversion reaction. Like, are you pre-programmed to like the taste of cilantro or not? Or chocolate or vanilla? The classic question, do you want chocolate or vanilla ice cream, right? You think, I like chocolate, but maybe it's a genetic thing that because when you eat chocolate, genetically your body responds in a certain way that releases more dopamine, so you feel better when you eat chocolate versus vanilla. So it's all really biochemical here. You think you're choosing chocolate over vanilla, but really it's already kind of in your genes. Or is it nurture? Is it that you were exposed to chocolate from a young age and you have an association of chocolate with, your grandmother's cookies and so that's why you like chocolate? What is it exactly? Is it nature or is it nurture? And it's worth bringing up the famous Minnesota twin study. Remember the Minnesota twin study? Where basically they looked at, over many years, twins that were separated at birth. Both identical twins and non-identical twins. And these are twins that were separated at birth and then reunited as when they were adults. So they wanted to see, compare nature versus nurture, essentially. And the most famous twins of the group...
Nurture one.
Well, let's see. So Jim Lewis and Jim Springer were two twins. They were separated when they were 4 weeks old. So they didn't know each other, of course. They were reunited when they were 39. didn't know each other, grew up in totally
Identical twins?
identical. They were identical twins that were separated at 4 weeks, didn't know each other, of course, had different upbringings in totally different places, different cities. Now, they both reported that they experienced the same headaches. They were both nail biters. They both smoked, but not only did they both smoked specifically the same brand of cigarettes. They drove the same type of car.
Whoa.
They vacationed in the same beach in Florida.
Wow. This
Same
is all
beach.
Throughout 39 years.
Right, without knowing each other.
Oh my God.
So they're identical twins. So the study concluded very clearly that those who were identical were significantly more similar than those who were non-identical twins, and concluded that genetics plays a huge role here. Like, on the other hand, you have psychological experiments, and some of the great psychologists of the past said, like, give me a baby and I'll make anything out of him. You can condition a child into whatever you want. So on the one hand, you have like all these kind of scientific experiments suggesting that it's more nurture. On the other hand, there's this huge genetic component. So what is it? Is it nature? Is it nurture? So we also want to explore that. How do we make sense of this question? And what does it have to do with our destiny, right? Like, do we have a spiritual destiny? Do we have a genetic destiny? So the first question, which is the question of God knowing, that's like the classic question. If God knows all of my choices, am I really making that choice? That's the question. So how can we deal with that? There's a few ways to deal with it. The Jewish way to deal with it is that God knowing your choice doesn't actually affect your choice. You still chose. Just happens to be that God knew it, but it's still your choice. And the reason is really that because God is outside of time anyway. So it's not just that God knows, because even to say that God knows is inaccurate, because there's really nothing that we can describe. God is this like totally almost unknowable. We can't really use human descriptions of God. So God is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and it's not really that God knows. Humans know. We have a brain, we kind of learn, we absorb information, but God doesn't need to know. God just is. That's really what Hashem is. The Zohar famously says that what is Hashem? God's name, the tetragrammaton, the God's name. Yud, He, Vav, He. Right, Yud, He, Vav, He, those 4 letters are really, the Zohar says, a conjunction of Haya, Hoveh, Ihiyeh. God was, is, and will be. God is the presence, right? Just like when Moses asked God, who are you? And he said, Eheyeh asher eheyeh, right? I will be what I will be. God just is, essentially. God is this being that spans all time. So God is beyond time, beyond space, beyond time. So for God, past, present, and future are happening really simultaneously. That's what the Zohar is saying. So it's not that God knows your future. It's that to God, past, present, and future is all the same anyways. So God is there at that moment you are making that choice 10 years from now. And God is there 10 years ago when you made a particular choice. God is basically inhabits all time. He inhabits all space. He inhabits all time. That's what Hashem means. Yud He Vav He means that He is in all time. That He's Ayahoveh Ihiyeh. What's amazing is Rabbi David Leitner points out, it's a beautiful chidush in his book, Understanding the Aleph Bey. It's a really good book. A beautiful chidush that I always like. One of the names of God in the Torah is Makom. Right? Makom. Like we say Yaakov Yivga, that Bamakom, that Yaakov met, he encountered God in Beit El when he saw the famous vision of the ladder. So one of the names of God is Makom. Makom means space, that God is in all space. God is in all time, but God is also in all space. And this is one of my favorite chidushim, because if you do, like, how do we measure space? We measure space in squared units, like length times width, right? Like your house is a certain number of square feet or square meters. So we measure space, area, in squared units. So Rav Leitner points out something amazing. He says, if you take God's name and you square it, you take Yud and you square it. Yud squared, 10 squared is 100. And then Hey squared is 25, right? 5 squared is 25. Vav squared, 6 squared, 36. And then another Hey, 25. So altogether, if you square God's name, you get 186. The value of God's name squared, when you make it into a unit of space, is 186. What's 186? Gematria? Makom. Mem, Kuf, Vav, Mem. 186. So it's an amazing mathematical connection that God's name, Yud He Vav He, means that He inhabits all time. And when you square it, it means that He inhabits all space, all makom. When you square the units, it's incredible. So, and that's really like Albert Einstein's whole chidush, that space and time are really one anyways. that we shouldn't think of time as something distinct from space, and that's just kind of like, its own entity. It's not its own entity. Space and time are one continuum, right? It's like one fabric, and space can warp time as well. So God is in all time. And actually there's an amazing theory in science today called block universe theory. Block universe theory holds that there is no past, present, future. Time is not linear. We have this illusion of time as if it's kind of moving forward and it's linear. But block universe theory says that no. There's a space-time continuum, and the universe is this place. And depending on where you are in the universe, that's a different place in time as well. So you can move through time almost like by moving through space. So different parts of the universe are at a different time, and all times are happening simultaneously. There is no past, present, and future. All these things are happening simultaneously, just in different places in the universe. And it's a really kind of elegant theory because it also avoids something. It gives you a chance to travel in a way through time, even though you're not traveling through time. But it would allow you to, using wormholes, if we had the technology to make wormholes through space and kind of travel faster than light and move across the universe, then it would allow you to move to different kind of time zones, but by using space. And what's really nice about this is that it avoids the classic issue of time travel, which is that the grandfather paradox. You know the grandfather paradox? Can a person go back in time and kill their own grandfather before they were born? Meaning, like, the person's alive, they have a grandfather, but can that person go back in time, kill their grandfather? But that seems impossible because then they wouldn't have a father and then they wouldn't be born. So how could they have been born to come back in time and kill their grandfather, right? So this is like the classic kind of time paradox, grandfather paradox of time travel. But with the block universe theory, it's saying that there is no going back in time. You're not going back in time, you're just going to another time, and all events are really happening simultaneously. So it avoids the grandfather paradox because there's no actual issue here. That because you and your grandfather are actually living really simultaneously and all events are happening simultaneously. So a person could theoretically actually kill their grandfather in the present without actually affecting any past or future, because there is no past or future. Everything happens simultaneously. And so you making your choice has nothing to do with God kind of knowing about it. It's irrelevant. Like you're still making...
If you yourself are stuck in one particular spot in your own life,
it's almost like
as a physical being, or
think of like this. Hold on. Think of like this. When you look at a movie is just a series of images, right? Whatever it is, 24 frames per second. You slow it down enough and you can see each individual image. So imagine your life is like a movie. It's like 24 frames per second. And you can travel to every frame of your life simultaneously.
Fun, but it is
right? Just like I can take a film of like a movie, literal roll of film, and unroll it, and I see every single frame before me simultaneously on one strip.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of like the analogy of being able to move to every frame in your life simultaneously.
That's possible here.
It's possible, yeah.
Here
It would be possible within this universe. It's a theory. Again, it's not even so much a theory, more like a hypothesis. So it's still in the early works. It reminds me, if you've seen The Matrix, we talked about The Matrix before a long time ago, The Matrix and Judaism. In the sequels, there's this scene where Neo and the Oracle are having a discussion in the playground. I don't know if you remember this scene. And Neo asks, the Oracle, again, knows everything that's going to happen to him. And she's like this kind of, godlike figure in the Matrix. She's a computer program, but she knows everything that's going to happen. And Neo asks the Oracle, he basically says, but if you already know, how can I make a choice? Right? Like, if you already know what's going to happen to me, how am I really choosing? And her answer is actually really, really clever in the film. So it reminds me of that because she said, her response was, you didn't come here to make the choice. You've already made it. You're here to try to understand why you made it. Like, that's really life. Life is about, you've already made all your choices and you're here to understand why you're making these choices, who you really are. It's about kind of understanding yourself. And then the Oracle, like, as she always does, kind of makes fun of him and says, I thought you would have figured that out by now. She always puts him down a little bit. But it's kind of like, in Judaism, we have this idea, too, in the sense that, ultimately the purpose of life is contemplation of who you really are and understanding yourself and understanding your journey in this world. And, in the Kabbalistic tradition especially, you have this idea of like spending time meditating on who you are. Like it's a practice called hitbonenut. Hitbonenut literally means to understand yourself. To go like to self, it's like self-reflection, contemplation. Who are you? Like on a bigger scale. And it's related to also tefillah, because when you're praying, lehit palel, right? What does lehit palel really mean? Anytime lehit means to do something to yourself, right? It's a reflexive verb. So, and plila is judgment. Literally, the word plila is used in the Tanakh. It means judgment. So lehit palel, which we say is to pray, really means to judge yourself, right? To understand yourself, to go deeper into the recesses of your mind and to figure out who you are and why you do the things you do. So it's an interesting idea. Perhaps you've really, in some sense, already made all the choices, and you're here to really uncover why you've made those choices. But ultimately, again, God knowing does not actually have any effect on your free will, because you're still making the choice, just that God inhabits all time, and all time's happening simultaneously for God, and maybe really for all of us. There's an amazing scientific study that kind of gives proof to this. It was done actually in Israel in 2000. Maybe you've heard of it. It was done at the Rabin Medical Center and by Leonard Leibovici. So what he did was he basically took a bunch of people and he told them to pray for patients at the hospital, at this medical center. And this was in the year 2000. And he did it was a double blind, a whole placebo group. It was perfectly scientifically accurate and rigorous. And he had people praying for different groups of patients at the hospital to see if prayer would help these patients recover faster. The catch here was, or what was amazing about this experiment, was that they were praying for people that were in the hospital years before, between 1990 and 1996. So people in the year 2000 are being asked to pray without even knowing about it. They're just given names and here's people to pray for. They don't even realize that they're praying for people not currently, but in the past. So he took records from the hospital between 1990 and 96. And again, everything was done randomly, double blind, nobody knew what was going on. And then when he looked at the results, the patients that were prayed for had a lower mortality rate, not by much, by a couple of percent, but still, lower mortality rate in the group that was prayed for versus the group that wasn't prayed for. But more significantly, they had much shorter hospital stays. The group that was prayed for was out of the hospital much quicker than the group that wasn't prayed for. So it was a very interesting study, very controversial study, but it almost seemed like praying affects you even into the past. Praying can affect even into the past, because perhaps past and present and future are really happening simultaneously. So when you think about saying Kaddish for somebody, right, why would you say year after year, remember people, say Kaddish for them? Right? Well, it's not just that you're commemorating the dead now, but it's almost like saying Kaddish with a person in mind could even help them in their own life, which is in their own, it could actually send energy into their own life, perhaps. Again, I'm not saying this is a scientific fact. I'm saying it was an interesting study that supports the idea that past, present, and future are actually all happening simultaneously. And what we do can even affect us in the past. And it's the same way that we say that what Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, what all of our greats did is affecting us today. Quite literally, it could be affecting us today. What they're doing is still reverberating across time and space. So yeah, that's the idea with choices and free. If that's too complicated, there's a much simpler way of explaining it, which is, another way of explaining this, of that God knowing doesn't actually prevent you from making a choice, is simply because God knows you, God created you, God knows you in and out. And so, of course, he's going to know what you're going to make, in the same way that a parent pretty much can predict what their child will choose with pretty high accuracy, because you know your child. When I ask my kids what they want to eat, I can already predict probably what they're going to say, because I know the foods that they like, right? Or if I give them a choice, let's say, between this food or that food, it's with pretty high certainty, you know with 99% accuracy, especially with little kids, right? You know what they're going to choose. It's pretty kind of clear. It's the same idea. Because you know your child so well, you know what they're going to choose. Same thing with God on a bigger scale. God is your Father in heaven, and he knows you in and out. So God knowing what you're going to choose is just because he created you. But it doesn't mean that you didn't make the choice. You still made the choice. And another analogy for it is that, if we do think of time as being something linear, and let's say I could build a time machine, and let's say I got into my time machine and I flew into the future and I met you 10 years from now and I saw everything that happened to you in the intervening 10 years. And then I come back to the present and I see you. And I happen to know, because I was in the future, I happen to know everything that happened to you in the next 10 years. But me knowing that doesn't mean that I'm somehow now preventing your choice. I'm not telling you anything, right? Maybe we don't even know, maybe we don't even meet and we don't even talk about it. You're still going to go on and live your life and make those choices. I happen to know them because I just went to the future and saw what happened. That's all.
But you're going to see something that's going to happen like a movie because I've been programmed to make it happen.
No.
A movie the script.
No. You did what you did. I just happened to go there and see it. That's all. And come back. Right? So because I'm not limited in time now, I can see the choices that you made. But my being unlimited in time doesn't have any effect on your choice. So that's the idea, that God is not limited by time. Yeah.
Yosef says to his brothers,
It's not you who sent me here, it's Hashem who sent me.
Right. That's like an even bigger thing, of that God orchestrates kind of everything anyways. Okay, things move according to God's plan. So that's really, that's the next question. That's what we have to address about God's plan. Right? So your destiny is, Rabbi Akiva says, "Akol tzafui ve'arashut netuna," that everything's foreseen, but you're given free will. But then also we have this idea that your soul comes here for a specific reason, and you're destined for whatever it is that you're destined for. Right. In next week's parsha, this question comes up. In next week's parsha, in Vayechi, when Yaakov blesses Ephraim and Menashe, there's a very interesting question there. Because you remember how Yosef wants Yaakov to put his right hand on the elder, on Menashe, and the left hand on Ephraim. But Yaakov crosses his hands and puts the dominant hand on Ephraim, on the younger one. And Yosef says, "No, what are you doing? You're making a mistake." And Yaakov says, "No, I know what I'm doing. I'm not making a mistake." And he says that the little one will be greater than the older one. So the question here is, wait, is Yaakov giving Ephraim the blessing because he knows that he will be greater? Or is it because Yaakov is giving him the better blessing, or the dominant blessing, he will end up being greater? You see the question? Did Ephraim become great later? The whole northern kingdom of Israel. The whole northern kingdom of Israel was referred to as the kingdom of Ephraim, right? The line of kings in the southern kingdom was from Yehuda, King David, and the northern territory, which was even larger, which had most of the tribes, the kings came from the tribe of Ephraim. So the question is, did Ephraim become so great because Yaakov gave him the better blessing? Or Yaakov gave him the better blessing because he foresaw that he would be greater? It really seems like, from what he's saying, he tells Yosef, "No, I know Ephraim will be greater." So it's like he foresaw that Ephraim will be greater and gave him that blessing. So everything's kind of foreseen already. Yaakov could see as a prophet into the future. But did that affect the choices that Ephraim made and his descendants made, and Yehoshua and all the descendants of Ephraim made? I don't think so, right? Probably not. They still made the choices that they made to get to that level, to get to that point. So how do we deal with this destiny? Every soul has a purpose. You need to fulfill your purpose. Now, of course, the Arizal tells us that if your soul doesn't fulfill its life's purpose, then you can come back. There is reincarnation. The soul can come back again, and it has another chance. So you're given a mission, but you're given free will also. So if you don't fulfill your mission, no problem, you'll come back. And the Arizal says in Shara Gilgulim, as written by his student Rav Chaim Vital writes, that souls reincarnate for several reasons. The first reason that souls reincarnate, so because a person sinned and has to rectify the sin. Pretty straightforward. A person sinned a certain Torah sin and has to come back and rectify it. The second reason, same idea in reverse. If a person didn't fulfill a mitzvah then they come back to fulfill that mitzvah. They missed out on something. So the first reason is if they sinned, they have to rectify the sin. The second reason is if they didn't do a mitzvah, they didn't fulfill a positive mitzvah, then they have to come back and fulfill it. And the third one is most relevant for us. Ashlishit hi sheba letzorech acherim leadricham uletaknam. So a person can also come back to fulfill some global purpose to help others, because they're needed in the world for some other purpose, for whatever it is, to guide other people, to rectify other people, to do something bigger in the world. So that's the third reason. And the fourth reason also, a person can also come back to marry their soulmate, because a person in their first incarnation, because of free will, didn't merit to marry their actual soulmate. So that person might actually come back because to marry properly, to marry the person they were meant to marry. So that's the idea. So a person has, definitely a soul has a purpose, a reason for coming here, or for even coming back, returning, but you're still given free will, and you can come back multiple times until that mission is accomplished. And the analogy that we've used before is like a GPS, right? You set a certain end goal into your GPS, into your Google Maps or whatever it is, Waze, and then you're following a particular plan, but you still have free will. You can make a turn here, make a turn there, take an alternate route. Sometimes you make a mistake and you go off the route. And what does the GPS do? It says, okay, recalculating, and it finds a route back. It's a different route, but it's the ultimate end point is the same. So that's kind of like with the soul. The soul is given a final destination, but the way you get there, there's many choices, right? And even Google Maps gives you various routes and calculates the estimated time, this route, that route. Here you have tolls, here you don't have tolls. So you have multiple options, and you can always also make the wrong turn and come back to whatever. You get the point. So that's the idea. I mean, another analogy is from like a corporate world. If you have a salesman who's given, works on commission and is given an expense account and says, here's your spending for your lunches and whatever, here's a company car, here's a phone, make a certain number of sales, right? That's your goal. You have to accomplish that goal. How you do that, the company doesn't really care. You can do whatever you like. You can come to the office, you can go to restaurants all day, you can cold call, you can knock on doors. They don't care how you accomplish it. You have to make these sales. That's it. So they give you some tools to help you, whatever it is, the card, the credit card, the phone, and you take it from there. Same thing with the soul. The soul is given a mission, it's given some tools, some talents. Every human being has their own special abilities and talents, God-given gifts that were given to you to help you in your mission. But how you get there is kind of up to you. That's the idea. So that's another analogy for the soul, for the destiny issue. Now, related to this is, a person has a spiritual purpose, but aside from that, there's also a possibility where a person might have to suffer. Maybe they're destined to suffer, which is kind of like the opposite side of that coin. What if there's a decree in the language of the Talmud, like if there's a decree upon a person that has to experience some kind of suffering? Does a person have to then now experience that suffering, or is there a way out of it? So the Talmud, of course, says in Masechet Rosh Hashanah, very famous, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Arba'a dvarim, there's 4 things that are mekara'in gzar dino shel adam, that can rip up a decree that's imposed upon a person from heaven, a heavenly decree, a negative heavenly decree upon a person. So it's been decreed from heaven that a person has to suffer some illness, God forbid, or go through some difficult, whatever it is. So there's 4 things that can potentially change one's fate in that regard. What are those 4 things? Okay, tzedakah is first, of course. Giving to charity. Charity.
Or chesed,
and
basically.
Yeah, chesed. Tzedakah really means like justice, right? Like doing acts, good acts, but specifically giving to charity, giving money to charity, but also you could be like volunteering for a charitable cause. That's the first one. The second one is tza'akah, which really means prayer, like heartfelt prayer, as if like screaming out to heaven. And the third one is Shinui Hashem, which is changing a person's name. Because your name is tied to your destiny also. Your Shem and your Neshama. Your soul is your Neshama and it's tied to your Shem, to your name. So there is a connection there. Veshinui Ma'aseh. And to change your deeds, right? To change your actions, which is like tshuva basically. And how do we know? So Rabbi Yitzchak brings proof. How do you know that charity can tear up a negative decree that's upon you?
The story, there's a story of the snake. No?
You don't even need to start. No, we need a Torah proof. We need a verse from Scripture to prove it. So for this one, we have the famous verse from Mishlei that King Solomon, what did King Solomon say? Tzedakah tetzil mimavet, right? Tzedakah tetzil mimavet, that charity can save from death. That's in Proverbs, in Mishlei. How do we know that prayer can? That heartfelt prayer, sincere prayer can? Because it says, Dichtiv, in Tehillim, Ve'itzaku el Hashem, batzar lahem, umimtsukotehem yotzihem. That they cried out to God, and God saved them from their distress. And how do we know about Shinui Hashem, changing your name? Because there's a verse in Bereshit, that we all know in Genesis, that Sarai ishtecha lo tikra et shma Sarai, ki Sarah shma uchtiv uverachti ota vegam natati mimena lecha ben. That God changed the name of Sarah. She was originally Sarai. God changed her name to Sarah, and now he says now she can have a child. When she was Sarai, she was barren, infertile. She changed her name. God changed her name to Sarah. Now she's fertile. So clear proof that a change of name can result in a change of fate. And shinui maaseh, changing your deeds, dichtiv. It says in Yonah, which we read on Yom Kippur, Vayara Elohim et maasehem. God saw their deeds. Veinachema Elohim al hara asher diber la'asot lahem velo asa. We know, as we read on Yom Kippur, that Yonah went to Nineveh, to the city, and prophesied to them, and they all repented wholeheartedly. And since they repented, God averted the decree that was upon them. So 4 things. So we always talk about the 3 of tshuva, tefillah, tzedakah, but there's also actually changing your name. So there's the 4th one is also there, changing your name. And actually somewhere else in Brachot, it says that how do you know with the names? What's so special about the names? How do you know manalan dishma garim? How do you know that names have an effect on a person's destiny? Amar Rabbi Eliezer, because the verse says, Lechu chazu mifa'alot Hashem, asher sam shamot ba'aretz. Look at what God does, that he placed shamot ba'aretz, and the Talmud says, you can read that word, al tikrei shamot, ela shemot, that God's wonders are within the names that he placed. Right? And you remember the famous teaching that when parents choose their child's name, it's not really so much that the parents choose, but like an angel comes and whispers the name into their ear. So that's also interesting. Having said that...
How about the wrong name?
Yeah, exactly. What if they choose the wrong name? There's another chazal where they say that a person has 3 names, that a person has the name that his parents gave him, and the name that people call him, and the name that he makes for himself. And the best name is the name that you make for yourself. Right. So if a person has a negative decree upon them, then they can definitely, through their deeds, prayers, charity, acts of kindness, and even changing their name, could potentially change their fate. Now, on this week's Parsha, the Zohar says that there's 3 things that are based not even on your merits, but simply on your mazal, on your fortune, which we have to explore. Yeah, that's on this week's Parsha.
Can we get a new mazal?
The Zohar and Parashat Vayigash. So it says it's on Mazal. Remember, Mazal literally means your flow, right? Nozel, the root of Mazal is Nozel. It means flow. So it doesn't really mean luck. It means like how things are flowing your way from heaven. So these are things that are really determined from heaven and not so much based on you. Really, the Zohar is quoting the Talmud in Moed Katan, because it actually says that in Moed Katan. Amar Rava, that 3 things come in from your Mazal and not from your merit. What are they? Chaye, your longevity, your life. B'nei umzone. Chaye b'nei umzone. That your longevity, how long you will live. Your children, whether a person will have children or not, or how many children. And umzon, and the person's parnasa, basically, their sustenance. These are the 3 things that lo bischuta, they're not based on your merits, ela b'mazala, in your mazal, talia, milta. So it's based on your mazal. Okay, so now we're saying, so like what, heaven kind of, there's a certain kind of fortune, I have a certain fortune when it comes to how long I'll live, my parnasa, my financial, how much I make, how many kids I have, that's entirely mazal and I can't change that at all? Well, not really, because remember what the Talmud says, that Mazal does have a role, that the constellations and the heavens and the astrological things do play a role in creation, but you have an ability to overcome that. Remember, Abraham felt like he will never have kids, right? He said, the Talmud says in Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat, Minayin she'en mazal le'Yisrael, shene'emar, that vayotze oto achutza. If you remember, God took Abraham outside and told him to look up at the stars and told him that your children will be. Amar Avraham lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbono shel Olam. God, Abraham told God, Master of the universe, Bein beiti yoresh oti, that I don't have any children. My servant Eliezer is going to inherit everything that I have because I don't have any children. Amar lo, God says, Lav, no. Ki im asher yetzeh mime'echa, that you will have your own children. And Abraham told him, Amar lefanav, Ribbono shel Olam, Master of the universe, nistakalti be'itztagninut sheli, that I looked in the astrological signs, I looked in the mazalot, in the constellations, ve'eni raui leholid ben, and I'm not destined to have a child. Abraham told God, I saw already that I'm not destined to have a child. And what did God tell him? Amar lo tzeh mi'itztagninut shelcha, leave your silly astrology. She'ein mazal le'Yisrael, that Israel is not subject to the stars and the constellations and the mazalot, the various flows from the heavens. Leave that aside. Don't believe in that stuff. I'm your mazal, right? God has said, I am, everything comes from me. So, the idea is that we have the ability to overcome our destiny. Abraham was not destined to have children. Sarah was not destined to have children. And they were able to, through these things, through your deeds, a person can actually change their fate as well into a more positive one. And that really takes us right back to when the sages said, Akol bidei shamayim chutz mirat shamayim, that everything's in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven. Because God is saying that I'm your mazal. If you believe in me, if you have faith in me, then anything's possible for you, right? With faith, anything becomes possible. And that's what we read in Pirkei Avot. We've all read this many times every year, that Rabban Gamliel says in Pirkei Avot, Hu haya omer, aser ratzono kirtzoncha. If you make God's will like your will, make your will God's will, kidei sheyaser ratzoncha kirtzono. If you do God's will, then God will do your will. And batel ratzoncha mipnei ratzono. And if you nullify your will to do God's will, then he will be kidei sheyibatel ratzon echarim mipnei ratzonecha, that he will then nullify the wills of others to do your will. Right? If you nullify your will to do the right thing, to do what God would want you to do, then God will even nullify the wills of others so that you will succeed. So that's an important secret to success in life. It all comes back to, again, aligning your will with God's will. If you have that tremendous faith in God and you do God's will, then everything will kind of flow your way. And that's why really we have a verse as well, that Bishvili nivra ha'olam, that the world was created for me. That everything kind of Bishvili, everything falls into my path, right? The world was created and everything falls into my shvil, into my path. If you have that great faith in God and you live a godly life and you live one with God, you align your will with God's will, then you can craft your own path in life. Right? The whole universe conforms to the path that you want. And so this is the final question now. The final question is, the Talmud is saying that ultimately the only real choice is having faith in God. Will you have faith in God? Because then you are now in charge of your fate and destiny. You become a master of your own fate when you are one with God, when you align your will with God's will. That's the true liberation. That's the true freedom. And that's actually, there's a gematria there and not just a gematria. The Torah, it says in the Torah that God gave us the mitzvot, charut, right, ala luchot, that they were carved into the tablets. And our sages say, don't read charut, read cherut. Cherut means freedom. That it's not that the mitzvot were carved into the tablets, but a deeper way of understanding that is that through the mitzvot is where your freedom comes. The mitzvot leads to your freedom. Fulfillment of God's laws is aligning with God, doing God's will, then makes you free. That's where the freedom comes from. Freedom is not choosing between chocolate and vanilla. That's not real freedom. Right? The real freedom comes from actually being able to do God's will, and then you have real choice in life where you can freely dictate your future, and you are in charge of your fate. And the gematria there is that we have 613 mitzvot in the Torah, 613, and the gematria of cherut, chet, 8, resh, 200, vav, 6, tav, 400 is 614. Meaning the fulfillment of the 613 leads to the 614, which is freedom, total cherut, total cosmic freedom of being a master of your own fate. So the final big question is, going back to nature and nurture and genetics, is your faith inherited? Do you have a gene for faith? Is there a religion gene? Is there a gene that makes you believe in God? Because if there is, then that ruins everything. So that's a big question. Is religion inherited? Or is it really in your hands? Akol b'yedei Hashamayim chutz mi'irat shamayim. That the only real choice the only real total choice that you have, without any influence from your genetics, from nature, nurture, whatever, the only real choice that you have, believing in God or not. This is something amazing. And I read this when I was in university. This is second year university. I was taking a second year psychology course. And we came into this, there was a whole section about this, about genetics and psychology and so on. So when I was so amazed when I read this in the textbook that I actually kept the textbook since then, just for this one page. You know how you sell your textbooks, right? The textbooks cost tons of money. So you sell, each year you buy the textbooks and you sell them at the end of the year. This is one textbook that I kept, one of the few, but this is the one textbook that I still have all these years later, and specifically for this page. And so it was really easy to look up. I had a sticky there from 15 years ago that's still there, that I opened that right directly to that page. It's from, the textbook is called Personality Psychology by Larson and Buss. It's like the go-to textbook for these kinds of courses. And they wrote in Personality Psychology, page 179, where they're talking about heritability of various traits. And I quote, "Not all attitudes and beliefs show these levels of moderate heritability, however. One study of 400 twin pairs yielded heritabilities of essentially 0 for beliefs in God, involvement in religious affairs, and attitudes towards racial integration. A recent study of adopted and non-adopted children confirmed that there's no evidence of a heritable influence on religious attitudes. The causes of individual differences in attitudes depends on the attitudes being studied. They range from moderate, 30 to 60% in the case of traditionalism, down to 0% in the case of religiosity." So their conclusion was that there's pretty much 0 heritability of being religious. There's a 30 to 60% heritability of various traditions and cultural things. So that's what you were saying, right? Like a person, Sfardis are a lot more traditional, for instance, right? Always have been. It's a cultural thing more than we inherit that as a cultural thing. But religiousness, in terms of actual belief, core beliefs, 0 heritability of religion.
Exactly. I'm not following that.
The Yirat Shamayim.
In terms of your Yirat Shamayim, to believe in God, to really believe in God or not, there seems to be no heritability for that. There's no gene for that. You do inherit certain, again, traditions, cultural things like that, but that's totally devoid, that's totally separate from actually whether you believe in God. That's 2 different things. The point is that you don't inherit a belief in God. That's up to you. And that's precisely what our sages said, that ultimately, akol b'yedei Hashamayim, right? Chutz mi'irat shamayim, that everything's in the hands of heaven except fear of heaven. That's the only real choice that you can make, ultimately, is believing in God. And that's the path to true free will, ultimately, where you're not subject to your genes, where you're not just acting impulsively like an animal, right? Animals are subject, instinctively, impulsively, because that's the way people live today. In a very physical, materialistic society, people basically are just impulsive, and it's their animal nature that's taking over, and they don't actually have free will. Right? The choices that they make are just basically what they're predisposed to, and that's what people argue today. Right? The argument today in the 21st century is that you can't change who you are. Right? I was born this way. That's it. Right? Like, this is the way I am. Accept me for the way I am. Right? Whatever it is. And people can get themselves out of committing all kinds of crimes by saying, oh, well, I was born this way. I was predisposed to do this, so it's not my fault. Right? That's become the thing in the 21st century, that nobody's at fault for anything anymore. In short, our only real choice is but to believe or not, to do the mitzvot or not, to be godly or not, to be aligned with God's will or not. And that's really the path to real freedom, real liberation, true free will, which is actually being above your animal nature, not acting like an animal, but actually acting like a divine being, and then being able to make true choices separate from your genetic and whatever biological predispositions, and as an actual kind of divine, godly being. And then at this level also, your fate, you're a master of your own fate as well, because you can tear up any of those decrees and you can set your GPS, and because you're doing God's will anyways, God gives you that ability, because only good can come out of it. So to summarize quickly, God knowing past, present, future doesn't actually affect your choice, because God is, was, will be. God inhabits, exists in all time, and so sees all your choices simultaneously and knows you in and out anyways. So God knowing doesn't actually take away from your own free will. And then the second thing is, yes, we're given certain predispositions. Our soul has a purpose, a certain final destination, and you are born a certain way, and there are biological factors that affect whether you like chocolate or vanilla or everything, just like they affect your physical appearance, your eye color and your hair color and so on. They also can affect other things, more psychological things and desires and so on. But you have the ability to overcome them, right? You have full control to overcome these things. And even today, really from the world of epigenetics, we see that actually our lifestyle choices can actually affect our genes. You can, by making the right choices, actually shut off certain genes. So even if a person's genetically predisposed to something, there's a whole new field of epigenetics where with certain choices you can... No, that's genetic modification. But like you, in your cell, like you can actually affect, your lifestyle choices can affect your genes. So they find that like smoking, for instance, turns on negative genes in the body, whereas exercise actually turns off those bad genes and turns on more positive genes, because your genes are regulated. They're not all...
Smoke and exercise.
That's a good point. So all kinds of things. Yeah, so epigenetics is actually showing, there's been epigenetic studies that show like prayer and meditation can affect your genes. That prayer can actually positively express your genes and turn off some of the bad. Epi means over, like in Greek, over something, above. So it's the layer that's like above the genes themselves, above that genetic code. The epi is what's controlling that code. So it's a huge new field. It's fascinating and totally revolutionized biology. And these things, by the way, are also heritable. So if you do what you do, you make certain genetic patterns, epigenetic patterns, and those epigenetic patterns are inherited. And again, and then your children can reverse some of those through their action. So so we know that today scientifically, that our choices can actually change our genes. We are not just subject to our genes. You are not just doomed to be whatever your genes say. So both spiritually and scientifically, both from a Torah perspective and a science perspective, your lifestyle choices and your actions and your beliefs can affect your DNA, can affect who you are physically. And from the Torah perspective, you can really be totally in charge of your life. If you align your will with God's will, then really the whole universe becomes your playground. And then that's when you really have free will and total control over your fate. So we'll end with that.